What's up, comrades? Welcome to this week's episode of Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. You know, on our Discord server, I've been saying recently that I truly feel we are moving into the golden age of Red Library. We are here to bring you yet another straight banger, full of icy cold takes, spicy hot analysis, jokes, shitposting, all the stuff you've come to know and love and crave from Red Library. But what makes this one especially unique and special is that we have a very, very special guest joining us in the library this week. The OG of leftist podcasting, the legend, the King Slayer, and the King Maker, C. Derick Varn. Derick is here to set the record straight on the eminent social critic Christopher Lasch, most well known for his book, The Culture of Narcissism. But Derick is going to be leading us through a lesser known of Lasch's works, called The World of Nations, Reflections on American Politics, History, and Culture. This book is a series of essays that covers a wide range of topics in the history of U.S. politics and culture. We're going to touch on asylums, imperialism, early feminist movements in the U.S., the temperance movement, the New Left in the 60s, and Derick is going to do what he does best, which is just dispense icy cold takes on the history of leftist politics, off the cuff, unrehearsed, unfiltered. You know, this makes it sound like this is going to be an Eric Andre skit. This isn't your parents' leftist podcast. This is extreme podcasting. All right, we'll just move on from that. This is going to be a two-parter as we had an amazing non-stop rapid-fire discussion for almost 3 hours. So you're going to be hearing part 1 this week, and then part 2 will be coming your way in the next week or two. Just a quick technical note, we normally do a standard intro and outro for every episode, but just to make things a little bit more smooth and a little bit easier on yours truly, whenever we do two-parters, we're going to save our customary outro for the end of the second episode. All right, let's run down the ways you can support Red Library materially, spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, metaphysically, as you so choose, if you aren't doing so already. If you'd like to become a patron for as little as $1 a month, that is less than $0.25 an episode, you can get access to our Red Library Discord server where we have book groups, movie nights, we plan future episodes such as roundtables, and you might be invited to be a guest and read through a book. If you'd like to become a patron, head over to www.patreon.com/Red Library Podcast. You can also find a link in the show notes, and you can find us no problem there. Big shout out to all the new patrons coming our way. By the time you hear this, we should have hit our 100 patron goal mark, which now means that Chairman Bain, yours truly, has talked Comrade Commissar Alex and Comrade Commissar Don into getting a tattoo. So I'm very, very proud to say you have helped make that happen. Remember to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. If you're listening on iTunes, please go down and give us one of those star reviews. Maybe write us a line or so, as that has helped spreading the show around, getting us into more and more potential comrades' ears, their minds, their hearts, their third eyes. Remember that Red Library is part of the Lost Horizons podcasting network, a collection of shows focused on developing the dialectical pessimist perspective. That includes us, our podrads over at The Regrettable Century, and From 78. Remember, we have a monthly roundtable discussion with a varying cast of characters from all the shows talking about all sorts of things related to politics, philosophy, psychoanalysis, and all that other good stuff. You can find a link for that in the show notes, or just search on your favorite podcasting app. Well, here we are still, after all. All right, y'all, let's do this thing. The eminent C. Derick Varn on the history of the incomparable social critic, Christopher Lasch. Enjoy.
And the relationship of Althusser and Bourdieu to Lacan, how the hell he became so important on the left, because I actually don't think there's a single left-wing oriented theory in the entire corpus of Lacan. Like, I'm being sincere here.
So, okay, listen, this is why I was so hyped to talk to you about this for a minute, because in my opinion, you know, I'm a practicing therapist and I'm really influenced by psychoanalysis. So there are things about practicing in therapy that I find Lacan can be useful for, but as a theory that you can apply to cultural analysis and politics, I find it just inherently conservative and reactionary, and it blows my mind how often people adopt it and seem to not really critique those elements in it. At least whenever I read Lacan, it seems pretty clear that they are there all over the place.
I guess when you look at someone like Zizek or Irigaray, you get something more interesting out of it. But even then, I was joking with Cooper that I found Bataille more actually leftist than Lacan. I think Bataille was insane and tried to do this weird Marxist reactionary hybrid mixed in with eroticism and literally start a death cult. So, I mean, and Lacan stole his wife, as I pointed out to Cooper.
This is true. Yeah.
And so I was just like, yeah, I don't know what you guys, I'm on Team Germany, like, all the way. Like, I'm mostly Frankfurt School influenced. I prefer classical psychoanalysis, arts, American breakoff, but I'm not a therapist. I'm an educator. And I actually, frankly, and this will come out when we talk about the Lash book, fundamentally distrust therapeutic culture deeply.
As a therapist, I think there is strong reason to do so. I think that the way it gets deployed, especially in the US and I think in France and like European context as well, it's like, yeah, you should be really fucking skeptical of it. I think it's a really healthy impulse to have.
And I'm also, for the same reason, I'm skeptical of the left's relationship to educational institutions, as will come out when we talk about this Lash book.
I'm excited to hear that.
Including secondary education. Like, I'm one of the few people who, because I'm a teacher and because I know how it works, I think most of it should be burnt to the ground.
Hell yeah.
And like, I don't even think teacher worker strikes and stuff would possibly ever be radical enough to reform education for a way that was meaningful for teachers. And it's partly because I have a functionalist understanding of what institutions actually do. I mean, like, a functionalist and a somewhat structuralist. I always hesitate to say structuralist because there's like, after Saussure, you get this weird anti-humanist turn in structuralism.
Yeah, I've listened to you enough to know that you're very skeptical of that. So my eyebrow went up as soon as you said structuralist, and I'm like, ooh, where are we going with this?
But in so much that, like, in a cybernetic formalist theory, aggregates emerge into complex structures, and those structures cause a feedback loop. The problem that I have with structuralism, actually, methodologically, as opposed to like humanist Marxism or whatever, and we can all have our wagging our fingers at Khrushchevian humanist Marxism for all of its reintegration of bourgeois pretensions or what have you. But that structuralism takes a description and flips it and makes a description causal because it rejects methodological individualism, because for some strange reason, methodological individualism is seen as bourgeois individualism or economic atomism, and it's neither.
Yeah.
The problem that you have when you start with structures and work downward is you effectively have no theory of the mind. So I used to talk about this, like, one of my big kicks with Marxism is Marx has an implicit theory of human nature because he has an implicit theory of mind, but he never actually fully articulates it anywhere. You know he has it because he talks about species being, and he talks about species being mitigated by social structures and time. I can get into, like, there's a lot of baggage that Marx brings into that we miss because we forget that he's, like, not just a Hegelian, but he's a Hegelian who studied Epicurean materialism, which has different, like, it is not actually one-to-one to like Western modern materialism. And when Marx is talking about that, there's this flipping back and forth between this kind of Epicurean formalism and like this deep emergent, almost positivistic conception of science that Marx goes back and forth on, and Engels goes back and forth on even more.
Yeah.
But because of that kind of ambiguity, we just jump over it. We don't have this notion of the human agent. And when it comes back in, it tends to come back into the Hegelian explanation, which is very, phenomenological and, frankly, I mean, like, idealist in the literal sense. Like, the person is an idea that emerges differentiated from opposition to other things from which it can know itself. Okay, and at a baseline, I actually think that's a true assertion for how selfhood works. Selfhood is kind of a creation of opposition. But this whole like idea that you can start with the structures and go backwards is bad history. It's really bad history. It leads to like the problem that like Foucault has. And I'm actually of Team France. Foucault's the one that I am most deeply sympathetic with, even though I think he's actually ends up being a conservative-ish thinker. But his insights into the function of liberalism, which kind of developed concurrently to, or a little bit later, but was not directly informed by like the dialectic of enlightenment style critique, right? That you really see that emerge in time in a way like with Foucault, like you see these institutions have functions of that sort of power functions and bureaucratic drift functions and stuff that like function in capital and are allowed to coexist in capital, but cannot be purely explained actually by like value production in like the strict Marxist humanist sense. And so you have to look at the way aggregates work. If you don't do that, you end up with what I like to call the Foucault problem. Like Foucault can't actually explain and does have no interest in explaining the shift between epochs. He just knows that they happen.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's just tracking them over time, but it isn't necessarily like a causal explanation of why one episteme leads to the next. So yeah,
right.
Derick, I don't know if you went far enough back in our catalogs. It's way back there, but me and Don actually did a whole reading series through Foucault's Society Must Be Defended. I was just saying to someone the other day that I really don't know how I can think about anything that calls itself Marxist today without at least having some engagement with Foucault's understanding of institutions and how structural power works and everything else. So yeah, I mean, I think it's something that for both of us, we've been interested in for quite some time, specifically as people who are coming from a more Marxist perspective.
Yeah, believe it or not, this seems completely unrelated to the book I picked, except none of it actually is.
I knew it was going to be tied in. I have implicit trust that you were just going to somehow weave all this together. I knew it was going to happen.
Well, Lash was a Foucauldian before it was cool. And he was also an explicitly Frankfurt School thinker. Now, he had issues with Foucault that I'm going back through all this stuff because right now I'm writing a book with Alan Van Tine on the development of Lash's thinking, how he ended up being, towards the 80s, he ends up being a kind of left communitarian who wants to like get beyond the left. He's very angry with the way left radicalism has gone. He's very angry with liberalism. He has a very complicated relationship with feminism that is often pilloried, that I think is not... It comes up a little bit in this book, but I think as people will often accuse him of not engaging with the literature, and I'm like, no, he knows the feminist literature. There are some things where I think he's blind on, like in a book that we're not going to talk about, but Haven in a Heartless World, he pulls on the anthropology of the family, but he actually doesn't know about doesn't seem to know about the revolutions of studying like pre-agricultural societies and how that changed a lot of those notions in anthropology, because those things were happening in the mid to late 70s as he's writing that book.
Yeah.
And he does... What I found frustrating is when he gets to the 80s work, he just doesn't deal with it. But I find him interesting because his fans are paleo-conservatives and workerist, kind of Angela Nagel, Red Scare-esque. And I don't say that to insult them, but social democrats with a vaguely nationalist undertone.
Yeah, well, listen, I mean, we're all about spicy takes on Red Library. So I was banking on you to just fucking let the missiles fly for this whole episode. So speak your piece.
So what I find interesting about their readings of him is, one, they all like his later books, not the ones that I'm actually more interested in. Although I do love Culture of Narcissism, I think is a brilliant book, and I think it deserves its place.
Yeah.
But I didn't want to talk about it again. Talked about it before. I think if you read this book, Agony of the American Left and New Radicals in American Society, I think is what it's called. And maybe it's hard to get, actually, but his book on American liberals' understanding of the Russian Revolution from like 1910 to, which is what he actually did his study on. He's very interesting. And his later work, after he gets frustrated and was always somewhat frustrated with the Frankfurt School's, authoritarian personality thesis, and which, like, I am too. I've always, that's your answer to the emergence of authoritarianism is like, there's a personality trait that somehow is ubiquitous in capital because I don't know reasons. So he gets frustrated with that in the 80s. And then towards the 80s, he starts just abandoning this idea that this anti-revisionist anarchist left has anything meaningful to say, particularly as it looks like the Soviet Union is kind of in a mess. Lash dies actually concurrently to the fall of the Soviet Union. We don't know what he would have thought about it. Unfortunately, most of his biographer is a conservative. Most of his students have ended up being sort of kind of moderate. I mean, that's not totally true. There's people who have ties to Lash, like Russell Jacobi and whatnot. But
yeah. Which, speaking of which, I think, whenever you and I discussed doing this episode, the first book you suggested was Dialectic of Defeat, but you've been, you're a specter haunting Red Library and The Regrettable Century for some time. We did that like 60 episodes ago now, but I just wanted to personally say thank you because that book really did influence, I think, all of our thinking a lot. And from what Chris told me, you suggested that. So yeah,
that's a book I've been pushing for a long time, even though I pissed Russell Jacobi off personally. Like, he commented on my blog about my review of it, because I go through his reading of the 60s and pointing out that he misreads all the French thinkers, like relationships to formal Maoism. Like, he just doesn't seem to know it. And he's so knowledgeable about this arcana of stuff going on in like the German left communists, the tensions between them and Zinovievism. Like, he knows all that stuff. So when you get to more modern stuff, I admit that the book, that stuff was very close to the time he's writing that book. So some of that's not as clear, but I'm like, you should have found someone who knew French better to go into that. I also critique them for not really understanding the weirdness of Lukács's relationship to Stalinism and those problems that really become clearer if you study a thinker who was close to Lukács, like who became kind of an anti-communist, like Lakatos.
Yeah, I've heard of Lakatos, but I haven't read much, so that's interesting to hear.
Well, Lakatos is a student of Karl Popper, who's still a Hegelian, and actually thought that Popper was right about Marxism, but thought that a new research program could lead to a new political program in Marx. He kind of threw it off as like maybe Trotskyism, because I don't know. Because it was oppositional. He didn't really know that much about it, but then kind of drops it for just dealing in pure scientific demarcation problem. But he has a relationship to Lukács because they both served actually in the Hungarian communist state. And in fact, Lakatos ends up on the wrong side of one of the political battles, ends up tortured and kicked out of the party. And that drives a lot of his anti-communism from personal experience, and that was directly related in a way that that I actually don't remember off the top of my head, but it's directly related to some of the stuff that Lukács was pushing in Hungary. I say all that, which is a long digression, right? Lash is a person who I think, because of his writing in the 80s, particularly The Revolt of the Elites and his critique of progress, he gets read as a conservative. Now, I don't see how you can read Agony of the American Left, of the book that we're reading today, World of Nations, and read him as a conservative. I don't, but I get why you would have at that point. One thing I like to say about The Revolt of the Elites is it may be a slightly conservative-ish book because he's super frustrated with the way the mid-'80s left has gone in response to Reaganism. He thinks they've ceded all grounds of talking to any even potential cultural working class over to the right. The right's spinning myths and lies. I mean, he basically points out like their traditionalism is invented. It's a traditionalism based on rugged individualism. It doesn't make sense. But he's so mad at the academic left, and he sees this emergent quasi-class of intellectual radicals as being complicit in Reaganism, even in their critiques of it. And he's dying of cancer, and he's also being influenced by Richard Niebuhr. He starts flirting with God stuff, as people tend to do as they are dying of cancer.
That's true, understandable.
And The Revolt of the Elites comes out. That kind of becomes a book, and a book that has a lot of influence on paleoconservatism, actually, but also on a lot of these people like Nagel and Dasha over at Red Scare, who see leftism as also part of a revolt of against these elites. We don't point out, for example, that all these people are technically PMC themselves, and even if they have working class backgrounds, and most of them don't, but some of them do, that this is really kind of a bad faith self argument, like they are implicated by what they're complaining about. But they all have this read from Lash from that time period. This book makes a lot of his concerns about educational theory, the function of the asylum, the function of the school, the function of liberal feminism to actually normalize things that were objectively bad for both women and workers in different ways, even if they were coming out of toil and stuff that was awful. And Lash also knows, he's at this point, he's not romanticizing the family. He may later, but he also knows that the bourgeois family construction of the nuclear family was really only available to a subsection of the working class, but between 1920 and 1960, and the bourgeois class probably from 1820 forward, right? So it's actually a very modern thing. But he's also talking about the agrarian family, which looks a little bit like the nuclear family, but really doesn't. And he gets into some class categorization problems, and I'll talk about that too, because that directly comes up in this book, where he doesn't know how to categorize sharecroppers and all these things that, from the fact leftists frankly don't study America, it's actually maddening how little most leftists know in the United States about their own history. They basically have the same bullshit high school textbook notion of it as patriots do in some way. They just think it's bad.
Well, I know that whenever we were talking, leading up to us recording tonight, you had kind of mentioned that there was the elements of the new left. It seemed like that was going to be something we'll focus on, but also you specifically said that most people on the left in America have no fucking clue about the history. I think you even said Depression era U.S. history specifically.
Well, I said anything from Depression era further back. So they might know a little bit about Debs and the Debs Wilson 1918 debacle. They might know about, if they're trots, they might know about the AFL, the CIO, Gompism, eclipsing the CIO, the purges in the 50s, the popular suppression of labor radicalism, which was actually done with the aid of Marxists. But then those Marxists get purged effectively by the AFL from the CIO when they merge. They might know that stuff, which again is not common in American history, but they probably don't know the specific history of the relationship between feminism and the development of New England mercantilism. They don't know anything about the burnt over districts and its relationship to political radicalism. And they don't know how to classify anything. They might understand slavery because that's a big issue, and settlers, right? But they don't know how to deal with the fact that like sharecroppers are not truly agrarian. They're not agrarian wage earners exactly. They're actually not. They're not really peasants because we don't have a peasant class, although they are tied to the land in a way that's like directly exploitative. So there's all these forms in American economy between 1790 and 1860 that we don't have categories for because they're not properly feudal or medieval, but they're not fully capitalist. One of the few writers I know who writes about this, actually, the Indian Marxist Janisarius Banerjee. But in general, like, there's no dealing with the fact that, like, and this is one of the things that Lash does. Like, he talks about the Mormons as recepting working class culture, and there are wage earners in early Mormonism, and they do represent non-elite culture. That's absolutely true. But most of them weren't wage earners. Most of them were sharecroppers or artisans, or the kind of people actually that Marx was trying to figure out what to do with in like the League of the Just. They're proletarianizing, but they're not a developed proletariat in any sense yet. And they're not really contributing to the value form in that way. So there's things where Lash is a very rigorous reader of Marx, and there's times where he's like doing rough approximations with the categories. Partly, I think, for clarity, because one of the things I know about him just from reading him is he hated the way radicals wrote. He didn't see the need for it. He didn't see the need for all the nihilisms and all that. He kind of agreed with Pierre Bourdieu, who would call that like a form of intellectual terrorism and a kind of cultural capital clout.
I feel like old Don over here is probably a big fan of that. I know he hates that kind of writing. We typically, I feel like whenever we read stuff together, that is usually the first critique that will come out of his mouth.
Conversely, I think there are times in this book that maybe in World of Nations here that Lash is a little bit too like, I'm going to write clearly, so I'm not going to parse out like these big differences in class in these early American movement. That said, I thought the first section of this, every leftist should read, because they've gotten this from Foucault, and they've gotten this from Marx, and maybe they've gotten it from Adorno and Horkheimer, but they don't understand the American context of the American contribution to it before the 20th century.
I have to tell you, opening, and I read this book as well. Normally, I think I mentioned whenever we have folks on the show, we kind of let them teach the book. But I read this because I was really fascinated. And that opening essay on the origins of the asylum in the U.S. context was just a really fantastic opening shot, because you're right, like most people don't think about it in the U.S. context. Before we dive in, Derick, I was curious, I mean, considering you're writing about Lash and like reading him very extensively, what made you want to do this Lash book? Is it because of these things that most people don't know about or don't cover?
Okay, so there's three reasons. This is probably the least read Lash book. If people read early Lash, they may read The Agony of the American Left. This book is probably, it touches on so many things to me that are emerging, and it's written over the period of like 1965 to 1973. All right, because this is a series of essays, so some of them are coming out in the early 60s. And you can tell, I'll give you one of the tells, for example. In one of the essays on imperialism in the Philippines, he talks about neoliberalism. He does not mean neoliberalism in the sense that term is going to be used, because the Mount Parallel Society hasn't codified that yet. I mean, he knows what that is later, but like he's just trying to come up with a phrase for the shift in liberal values that is not talked about, that happened actually all over the world, but particularly in America, that obscures the left liberal distinction. Because American laissez-faire liberalism effectively is self-killed in the long depression in like the 1880s, 1890s. Like it's done. It's intellectually bankrupt. Yes, you meet weirdos in Europe who might still believe it, but in America, almost no one does. And this leads to this malaise that leads to a new like muscular, more statist liberalism, a liberalism that is not wrong, actually, to see as, like, there was a reason why it was, like, quiet on fascism early on, particularly in the Italian form. And it's not just because fascism is the highest stage of capitalism or some shit like that. Like, it's because they're experimenting with how is the capitalist state going to relate to society in a different way when laissez-faire just does not work. And they know it. And they know it before the Great Depression. So imperialism comes up as a way to deal with this. The expansion of the state, the end of laissez-faire policies, these are all things that come out of a crisis of liberalism. Liberalism's division into conservatism and progressivism, as we kind of think about it now, happens in the 1910s and 1920s. I mean, and you have a character, if you look at the tension between Roosevelt and Taft, which is something that Lash is pointing out, points this out extensively. But that was already happening. Like, the asylum movement is actually a precursor to the prison movement, not the other way around. People often get the causation backwards. Reformist prisons, yeah, that comes out of Bentham and whatnot in England. But it's not a common idea in the States. I mean, the state's model of imprisonment was basically a way of holding you to make sure your debts got paid. Or if you look at early colonial America and early post-colonial America, local laws are pretty punitive. They're either fines or they're like stocks. There's like long-term imprisonment's not really a thing.
Yeah.
And that mirrors similarly to, what Foucault describes in prisons. And Lash was onto this in the 60s when almost nobody in America was reading Foucault. This is before it was a hot button topic amongst literary theorists. He's also a historian, which makes it even weirder.
I mean, there was something that I kind of marked out that really grabbed my attention, and just because I'm super pedantic, this is on page 7, but he says the theory of total institutions is worked out by Irving Goffman and Gresham M. Sykes helps us to see that, quote, what is prison-like about prisons, unquote, in Goffman's words, is found in institutions whose members have broken no laws. In other words, prisons, insane asylums, orphanages, and other institutions as different from each other as concentration camps at one end of the spectrum and convents at the other, nevertheless share certain common features. So, I mean, as soon as I hit that and the invoking of Goffman, especially, and that definition, again, it struck me as that, why are we not talking more about this other sociological, historical context about this discussion about asylum? So for me, I thought that was a really interesting connection point. And I've read Goffman and studied sociology a bit. And so even for me, that was a little surprising.
Well, it is interesting to see that like Goffman and then stuff that was trending in sociology before Foucault had actually realized some of the same things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
And in frankly, much clearer ways.
Shots fired. Shots fired at Foucaultians.
As a side note, one of the thing that frustrates Lash, particularly once you get into the 80s, is he notes something that I noted in the aughts. Why are all these Foucaultians really invested in building institutions, which they know to be prisons?
Fantastic question.
Like, did they read this as an instruction manual? Like,
they hand out discipline and punish, and they're like, here, this is everything we should do. Read this, memorize.
Right. I mean, Lash is also, actually 2 pages after that, he explicitly mentions Foucault. Like, and again, I think this is one of the earlier essays in the book. So this would have been like in the 60s when I don't even know that he was super well translated in English.
Yeah, I think it was like, maybe early to mid 70s, maybe, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, at least I've studied Foucault pretty extensively too. And I feel like that was kind of where he really started to catch hold. And I think whenever Rabinow and Dreyfus brought him over and he did lectures and they did their book on Foucault, I think it was around that time. Right.
So I know most of this from Dreyfus because, again, my background's actually not in history, despite what everyone thinks. It's in literary theory and an educational theory and actually creative writing. But it's fascinating to me how he's onto these things from just reading close readings of sociology. One of the things, though, he points out is there is a revalorization of things. So if you go through, like I said, the first third of the book, the Limits of Liberalism essays, they blow my mind because they talk about all this stuff in an American context that's often ignored. But they actually go into detail with both structural and micro examples. So it's nice to read in the sense that you get both the large-scale structure, but he's willing to give you specific anecdotes and historical examples and, frankly, micro-history so that you understand the context and not just as this kind of abstract spectrum schema, but in the context of individual lives. Something that, frankly, I think is missing on a lot of left-wing writing but from basically this time forward. Foucaultians are a little better about it. If you read Dreyfus, they often write this way, but like if you read most theory now, finding a specific instance application of it doesn't happen that much.
Yeah.
Unless it's like some kind of cultural movie analysis or something like that. Don't get me started on cultural studies.
I kind of want to get you started on cultural studies, but I'll leave it at your discretion since you're leading the episode.
I one time said, why do we care so much? I know that people like Raymond Williams like to rebuke people like Christopher Caldwell who just don't think that there is such thing as proletarian culture, and Raymond Williams thinks that there is one. But then I also like to go like, yeah, but Raymond Williams, the bourgeois are the people still making that. Right, it's not made by pros for pros, and even when it is, it's not financed by pros for pros. So, you can't be that naive about it. So, I think the Origins of the Asylum essay is brilliant. It talks about how the asylum kind of becomes the model for not just prisons, but for the entire institutional apparatus of the United States in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. Progressive institutionalism moves from this kind of reformist notion to a notion of control. Okay, that's common. I mean, people have been talking about that since the 60s, and he's writing in the 60s and 70s right for this, so that makes perfect sense. He's on that. But it's how specific he can lay that out. He can give you the exact examples and numbers when this happened. Its relationship to capital, though, actually interests him, and he has trouble articulating it. So you go through that, then you talk about seniority in the family in New England, and the New England literary culture around women, and right before the Civil War during the antebellum period, which is often read as this great precursor to Seneca Falls and all that. And what he shows is this basically no, the nature of marriage has changed. The nature of family has changed. That's because of changes in work and changes in the way we organize work, and beginning to see the development of communities and particularly amongst a sort of people who are kind of between proper bourgeois and proto-proletarians who are petit bourgeois enough to kind of fall down or go up. They're developing this culture among writers, among women writers, particularly when they're unmarried, because they don't have anything to do, and their communities are becoming more and more dispersed and spread out through, particularly, the westward expansion is playing into this, and the development of industrial cities is playing into this. And so it's not so much this cry for women's liberation. It's no, they want friends, and literature is a way to do that.
Yeah.
And so our gloss on that, is also taking people at their word. This kind of the feminine reformism that he talks about, which we often read as progressive, but is not. I don't think it can be read actually progressive or reactionary.
So I think that's an interesting point. I'm curious how you would read it as having a combination of both tendencies or just not even fitting cleanly into either one?
It's a complex social phenomenon in which the same things are pushing things in both directions. I hate to get all obnoxiously Marxist and jargony, but there's a dialectical tension in which you're generating new progressive social forms, but you're also pulling back on other things. So there's this sense of which this want for community is both positive, but also has a kind of scolding and policing mechanism.
Yeah.
It doesn't deal with a lot of things. Industrialization is becoming from a crisis of industrialization. One of the biggest ones, for example, is we don't deal with the temperance movement very much and its exact role. But what's not often talked about is the temperance movement, the turn against drinking. Why did it take, 2,700 years or so for Europeans to all of a sudden have a problem with alcohol? What's the turn? The turn is industrial purity standards means, and the able to produce at scale means that you can produce alcohol that's far more potent than you could produce prior. So you look at traditional European spirits, right? They're going to be 40% alcohol. You don't have the ability to modern self-produce Everclear until 1850. So that liquor becomes way more potent. And because of industrialization, being drunk has way more consequences, particularly when you get the cars. So, one thing we forget about early American history is nobody was sober at all.
Isn't that current American history as well? That's an interesting point too, Derick. So I guess kind of thinking through it in that lens, it's that the sort of shift in industrial production and the health effects of alcohol consumption as it became more purified, it became more wide scale. The response culturally to it was also, I guess, a response to the shifts in industrial production and the purity of it that could be generated.
And also you're more dependent for a variety of reasons. Let's talk about one of the things we talk about the end of the communitarian life amongst proto-proles. I'm going to use proto-proles here, not proles, because I hate, for example, when someone like, who wrote Caliban and the Rich again? I know her name.
Silvia Federici?
Yeah, Federici, like, talks about proles in, like, medieval Europe, and I'm like, no! You're describing class dynamics, but like, those people aren't actually really propertyless. So, I mean, even with the idea that the proletarian isn't always the working class, no. So, like, similar here. So I'm going to say proto-proles are like people who are being proletarianized from whatever, like, yeoman culture we had in the United States.
Actually, I do want to ask you something. You were mentioning earlier about how even for Lasch, he might be struggling or obscuring the different forms that weren't fully fitting within the capitalist structures, but also weren't truly medieval or peasant-based. So, I mean, do you see that maybe what a lot of people struggle with, I've even heard you talk about the designation of, like, PMC is not official, like, it shouldn't be considered a class unto itself. I mean, do you see it as like it's a complex way that, like, it's a process of proletarianization without necessarily, like, fitting into categories in a really clean way?
Well, one, I think we have to deal with the fact that there's some institutions in Western life across the scale that are pre-bourgeois that still exist. My favorite one is the institution of the university. It's been bourgeoisified, and elements of it have been proletarianized, but it is not a capitalist institution. It predates it. Its structure is medieval. Its structure is frankly feudal. The whole, like, the ideas of masters of study and all that don't get codified really until, like, the Prussian reforms and how they affect the United States. There's this weird, like, back and forth between the codification of university, particularly between England, Germany, and the US. But its basic institutional DNA is pre-modern. It's not even, I get mad when people talk about, like, school reform in terms of it just being industrial, and Lash gets into this book towards the end. It's not even totally true. It has elements of it that's industrial, elements of it that post-industrial, and elements of it that are way, 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 way pre-industrial that go back to pre-capitalist formations. They're melted, but they're not evaporated into air, to use the Marxist metaphor, right? And so we have a lot of hangers-on like that. PMC stuff is a lot of that into that. Also, we have one of the things that's happening when you study the profitability of commodities is commodity production is, particularly for base commodities, unbranded commodities where you're not dealing with IP, the only way to make commodities really highly profitable is monopolization rent. So there's PMCs that are servicing that, like PMCs, right? But even most right-wingers who talk about managerial or professional classes, like Sam Francis, you know, like the proto-Nazi, whatever, like quasi-Nazi, I don't know, proto-Nazi, not that word. But, you know, like paleo-conservative asshat, who's really smart but, like, darkly evil. They realize that like when they talk about the professional class and managerial class, they're not truly classes. They cannot reproduce themselves. They don't function in that way. They don't have a clean relationship to capital. They don't have a clean relationship to social status. They're strata. The only Marxist that I know that's really tried to categorize this in a way that makes sense is not like Ehrenreich. I mean, like, credentialing as a class demarcator, credentialing expansion, which is one of the things Lash is warning about in this book, in the second half of it, means that, like, to enter certain sectors of the proletariat, you have to have some kind of credential. And even if it's not an educational credential, it's a license. These cartelizations and credentializations mean that free labor is basically only in the service sector. You know, someone the other day was like, well, my plumber doesn't need to pay for, like, Joe Plo. It's a conservative friend of mine who's trying to make a workers argument at me. And, you know, my plumber doesn't need to pay for kids' free college. And I'm like, one, I get it, actually. Free college is, we're not going to talk about my opinions about that because it's going to piss a lot of people off.
This would be the venue to do it if you wanted to piss people off.
Well, I mean, I think the university is actually a deeply reactionary structure. Its main service. The left deal with it was a deal with the devil, which is actually defang the left utterly.
There we go. That's what I was hoping for.
And it is ironic that the people who talk the most about social equality functionally serve the main driver of class stagnation in the United States. That is an irony that it cannot be empirically or objectively denied. And it is not very well dealt with, nor can the fact be said that, like, that institution is now parasitic on itself in a way that was not, like, before the 80s. And the writers that saw this coming were basically two. Lash talks about it a lot in the 60s and 70s, and Jacques Barzun, who is not considered a leftist thinker of any sort, predicted it as well and called it exploitative, and it would kill the university and university culture. Leftists have largely, they don't, I will say, I haven't read that many leftist writers on education who are right about this, except for David Blacker. Christopher Lash writes about it. David Blacker, a contemporary writer, writes about it. There's a couple others, but most leftists do not want to touch the academy and its role in all this, probably because most of them are dependent on it.
Well, that was going to be my question. Do you feel like that's a direct interest or like class interest of theirs in the fact that they are
and I think that actually leads to like this illusion of the PMC. Okay, since we're really off, we're freewheeling this introduction here. One of Lash's concerns is something like the PMC. He is afraid that both public and university intellectuals are becoming a quasi-class in America, and that they can speak, as we would say, they speak woke. That like Devil can quote scripture, HR can speak woke. He knows that profoundly. And sees that emerging, and sees actually that like he's tracing that history. Actually, one of the things he's saying is the limits of liberal reform lead to the Marxist left, but the Marxist left subject isn't the working class anymore, particularly in the 60s. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Sectarian organizations, because they're based off of professional revolutionary models, often have a high commitment threshold. They're not they're not designed to be mass. People miss this, but they're not designed to be mass organizations. They take high levels of commitment. Who has that? Students. Yep. Then in the 60s, now you don't see this anymore, but in the 60s there was this attempt to recast students as an oppressed subject. That has largely gone away, but I mean that is something that Lash is responding to, and he's like, what? But also that maybe it does feel like you're an oppressed subject because you exist in these institutions that are prison-like, but you are going to become a kind of curtailized, protected class at the end of it. Like, it's like you have to do your stint in hell. And I mean, I know like plenty of academics who literally talk this way. You know, it's basically like this giant gaslighting, hazing thing that's formalized in the university.
I can't remember what it was, but recently I was reading something from around this time as well that was talking about an alliance between students as dealing with alienated labor or alienation writ large, and that creating a potential alliance with the proletariat, the working class, as if that was going to be the shared, almost like bridging between early Marx and later Marx. And that was going to cause the revolutionary subject to really be formed, was this welding together of the two.
And what you actually end up seeing in the late 60s, and you even see it in organizations I respect, like the Panthers. The Panthers had a lot of working class base, but they also had a fascination with lumpen as a subject, particularly Cleaver. Like usually, I always tell people, like, don't just study the Panthers, study like why Cleaver and Newton and Long and Carmichael and all that, what they actually disagreed on profoundly. I think it doesn't surprise me that like Cleaver dies a Nixonite if you actually look at the way those things go. But there's this fascination with lumpenization. They were actually justifying this off of Mao's real experiments. Mao saw the oppressed masses as a non-enemy class. And that's an interesting way to think about it, right? It is not a friendly class. It is a non-enemy class. Classically speaking, Stalinist and whatnot, and sometimes Maoist too, took a hostile stance to these groups. You know, frankly, they would shoot them. You know, you hear Alexander Kolotai talk about like sex workers as deserters in the army of labor, which is weird. The weird Marxist, like, labor is bad, also it's great.
One of those weird contradictory positions that Marxists sometimes find themselves holding. Yeah.
Right. Depending on what we need at any given time.
Of course. Well, you know, we like to be flexible in our use of concepts and definitions. So depending on who we're arguing with on Twitter, we'll use whichever one makes the most sense.
Right. And these kind of contradictions are part of this milieu that Lash is writing about. But Lash is saying, look, this is not even unique. There was a tendency before Trump. God, I don't want to get into like the schizophrenia Trump has caused, but there's this tendency before Trump to kind of like, oh well, 60s was this influx of Maoism into American leftism. It really screwed it up. It was also an influx of Trotskyism into American leftism. Before the 60s, both Trotskyists, Maoists didn't exist, and Trotskyists were largely irrelevant. Like the SWP was tiny. Compared to the CPUSA, which was gigantic, and the SPA was somewhere in the middle. These institutional histories and stuff are important, and what Lash is writing about, and actually, is first he traces the changes of the liberal state, and he's like, look, you have to actually deal with bourgeois historiography. You can't just like pick and choose the subject. Now, he's writing about this before Howard Zinn writes, you know, the People's History, but he's saying, like, going back and pinkwashing the past and finding these obscure subjects means you often don't know the great way all these things were actually working. If you don't study the elite, you don't know what they were fucking doing. And so this leads into the gaps of what's actually drawing society together. You can't, like, pretend that bourgeois society is somehow defined by its marginalized characters. And a lot of the left does that, and at least a bad historiography. We don't really understand the past. That does not mean you, like, pick up the great history, you know, the great men of history thing. Lash is actually saying, like, you have to do both. What ends up happening is we don't really do either.
The worst of both worlds.
Right. And he you know, he talks about that a lot of times, like look at Mormonism, his example in that early chapter. That Mormonism chapter is, you know, I live in Utah, so I'm not from Utah, I'm from Georgia. You know, I have no real love for Mormonism. You know, every now and then I get all finished the Missouri War on people. But you know, and when my paleo conservative past, you know, comes up, I'm like, what about the MQ? And they're like, what? The Mormon question.
I think we might steal that phrase if you don't mind.
But Lash is right that early Mormonism has a lot of the contradictions of early American, like, non-elite culture. I'm going to use the term non-elite, not proletariat, because it's better. Yeah. The burnt over district, there is all the racism in it. Also, anti-racism is in it. They're both there. Starch anti-feminism, patriarchal family life, but also proto-feminism, sexual liberation are both there. They're both there in the same movement, which is being suppressed because it brings all these things out in a religious way and is really cutting against American society. What Lash points is the irony of this is when, even if you look at this, if you know the history of Brigham Young, you start off with, like, this guy who's basically like a kind of religious fanatic proto-communist, to someone who's totally okay with the bourgeois orders and, like, making deals with. And he's like, look, this was a radical experiment and, like, working class culture that, when normalizing to American society, by the time that, like, Utah wants to reconcile with the U.S. for state, doesn't really want to fight it anymore, doesn't want to go out and be weirdos in Mexico fighting blood feuds, you know. I will say Lash doesn't know all of it. And he's like, look, like, he says, like, if you want to talk about its racist history, fine, but, like, that's true of every religion in America, so you can't, like, that can't be a unique thing, the Mormons, that they, you know, that they had weird curse of Ham theology. Frankly, most Baptists in America did until, like, the 1940s. So what actually makes it unique, and what's unique is that it's actually part of, like, the radical norms of early like, non-elite culture are maintained in early Mormonism, but they also totally reconcile in a really pernicious way with conservative American thought as it gloms on to the thing. So this possible religious utopianism flips on its head. And you see that he's marrying this. He's saying, like, and you see this also too in kind of elite radicalism, which is critiquing its own culture, but then justifies it. So that's what the parallel is there for. That's why the Mormon thing is right by the asylums chapter, is like this critique of power becomes a new form of power itself, a new form of normalization. This critique of bourgeois culture becomes a way that bourgeois culture can reestablish itself. So you're like, okay, well, what's all this? You know, why do this stuff about the 1890s and jump to the 1960s? What's that about? The parallel is you're doing it again. Like, you are actually recapitulating trends in capitalism and saying they're anti-capitalist when they're not at all. Capitalism has racist origins. It is both, because of its origins, it is necessarily exclusionary and thus has a tendency towards racialism. But it can move around, and has, like, otherwise, like, there would not be capitalist countries in non-white, like, outside of Europe, and that's obviously not true. So what's up there? What's going on? He's on to that. He also knows the history of populism in America, which is not studied. And populism in America starts off as a radical left movement. Like, they were taking over state houses with guns. This is often forgotten. And they made allegiances with Democrats or Republicans, depending on who was the more progressive party in the area. They were also working with socialists. Like, it was a radical force that flips and becomes conservative in reaction to other forces and is able to be channeled into imperialism because of fears, need for expansion, land. But it's not as simple as just settler colonial at this point. There's something more complicated going on. Most people do not directly benefit from the exploitation. The big example he talks about, the exploitation and subjugation of the Philippines. And in fact, ironically, a lot of the conservative forces he points out are those who oppose it because of weird ass racial notions. Like they're like, oh, look, if we become imperialists, then we actually have to integrate these people into our society. This is actually also something, if you study the Mexican-American War, a lot of the anti-imperialist arguments were there this mixture of sympathy for the Catholics in Mexico because they were Catholic, but also like, we don't want all these brown people that we're going to have to figure out what to do with.
I have to tell you, the chapter on the Philippines, the essay on the Philippines, was one of my favorite parts of the whole book. I found it completely phenomenal and just horribly damning of anything that remotely calls itself liberalism, especially in this day and age.
Yeah, I mean, well, the second wave of imperialism, like the first wave of imperialism is the U.S. project itself, like the Empire of Liberty. Okay, but that is liberal. But that's before conservatism and liberalism really differentiates itself out as liberal trend. I mean, one of the unfortunate things about language is like progressivism is a form of liberalism. Conservatism in America is by and large also a form of liberalism. Conservatives like to hide that, although every now and then they'll be honest about it when talking about classical liberalism or something or other. But it's because both things. Like, look, like Marxism comes out of classical liberalism. We all have classical liberal orientation if we're post-European. There's no way around that. But these tendencies, the imperialist tendency was part of the progressive side of things. And it was often conservatives siding with workers who muddied the lines. And they did so in very messed up ways. It actually led to the reification of race in America, which is also something that Lash is keenly aware of.
Hey, Derick, would you actually mind if I read a section on that note since we're talking about it?
I would love for you to.
This is on my page 75 for anyone who might be following along. It says, Lash says, in the first place, the anti-imperialists argued if the Filipinos became citizens, they would migrate to the U.S. and compete with American labor. A prospect especially alarming in view of the racial composition of the islands. As Samuel Gompers declared, this is Gompers, if the Philippines are annexed, what is to prevent the Chinese, the Negritos, and the Malays coming to our own country? This was more, and that was the end of the quote, this was more than an economic argument. It implied that those people were accustomed to a low standard of living, and what is more, that they were incapable, by virtue of their race, of longing for anything better. Just hearing Gompers that come out of Gompers' mouth was just, I can't say it was super surprising, but still just shocking to like hear how embedded, again, like the same trends, the same ways of thinking. And that's, by people who are saying we need to protect U.S. workers from, the brown and yellow hordes. I mean,
Trumpism's talking of this point is not new, and in fact, it was a common Democratic point probably until the 1990s. The history of the other thing that Lash is keenly aware of is like the left's détente with the Democrats is modern and a result of FDR. He doesn't so much talk about this in this book, but he knows it. FDR is what gets black people into the Democratic Party, but that's not a fully done project until Goldwater. But it actually starts with FDR. However, they were also still keeping the segregationists in the party and somehow trying to keep the Popular Front aligned. When you think about that contradiction and what kind of mess that would have led to in American politics, I mean, you have to remember, like the CPUSA, when it's not being suppressed because of McCarthyism, is endorsing Democratic candidates, and you have diehard communists talking to Kennedys. Hansberry, famous for Raising the Sun, but also famous for talking to Robert Kennedy, was a communist. But this is all maintained off of this grand coalition with the Democrats, which Lash realizes is untenable. But it emerges because of this, what he coins as he calls it neoliberalism, but we should call it new liberalism, that happens between Roosevelt and FDR that was based on kind of a racist project. FDR expands it out, kind of has an integralist notion of Americanness, where it's like, okay, we can include all these unwashed masses basically that we don't really want, and we can accept, if we help enough white people, we can accept helping these other people too. That's more or less the deal. We can play with helping black workers. Part of that actually is so that black workers can't be used as scabs. So there's this sort of almost proto-Adolf Reed logic there that it's in our mutual interest to increase this, not because we care about black people, but because we need a united front against capital. And it ends up being objectively good for black people, whether people are racist or not. But that's a tenuous thing. and it's hard to maintain. So you have this like demarcation, like, okay, well, fine, we can accept black and brown, but you better not let yellow in. And then that flips. And Lash is just watching radicals justify this as if this is radicalism itself and not just a response to the way we are socially reproducing capital in America.
So overall, I mean, do you think that's where Lash's real value and sort of, I guess, like the incisiveness of his critique really hits home, is the way that radicals and people on the left don't realize how they're propagating or sort of, reconstituting the relations of capital in all of this as these,
right,
political events are happening?
Well, and also he has a more complicated notion of of ideas and capital relations. He truly sees them as feeding back on each other. Like when you read one of the last, when he's critiquing Jacques Ellul, I mean, he talks about the technological society and all this. He's like, look, and the last two essays basically talk about this. Like, you can't, both the American dystopian and utopian understanding of science is stupid. Like, science serves certain things. Its teleosis based on the society that organizes it. The technological society misses this. It misses who owns production. But he actually praises Jacques Ellul because he's like, yeah, you actually write about America and like American cultural trends, and like no one else is actually doing that. They're all talking about Europe weirdly, or like talking about Europe while also complaining about Eurocentrism.
Me and Don were talking about this, that Don was actually the first person who introduced me to Jacques Ellul, and I read his book on propaganda, but I think you've read The Technological Society at some point, right?
Yeah, that was a long time ago, but I did read it.
It was a very pleasant surprise to see Lash talk about him, because I think for me and Don's conversations, we feel like, maybe for good reason, I guess, but most people don't even know who Ellul is anymore.
I was gonna say, I feel like he was talked about a lot during probably the time period Lash is writing in, but I feel like he's pretty well marginalized or forgotten nowadays.
Yeah,
I know some weird poet anarchist who know him. I read him when I was a conservative.
Oh, okay.
Interesting. You guys know my history, right? Like, I went left, right, left. So I started off as like a punk Trotskyite, not Trotskyite, Chomskyite. Kind of, well, Trotsky, everything all together, Rage Against the Machine, dealt with the actual into the 90s, went to the Battle of Seattle as my first big thing. Was disgusted by it, actually, how it seemed really performative and didn't change a damn thing.
But the aesthetics were great, though, Derek. Weren't the aesthetics good?
And then we smashed a bunch of windows and
hell yeah,
locked ourselves in chains, and but I was still kind of on that side. Went through college, got into post-structuralism actually for a little while.
That's how you ended up on the Examine Life, right? In relation to
I used to teach like all that stuff, structuralism, post-structuralism, back when I was a prof.
I should say, is it the Examine Life or the Partially Examine Life? What's the
Partially Examine Life?
Yeah, I used to listen to it all the time. Yeah. Anyway, never mind.
So I ended up on that and on Diet Soap, the predecessor to the media end of Zero Books in some ways, based off that. But also, like, I was studying Marxist history at the time, and I've been a committed Marxist since like 2009.
That's why you're the OG.
Have been Marx adjacent since 2005 or so. But anyway, I went through this period of paleoconservatism because I thought that they were actually for reasons that actually appealed to Lash. I read Adorno and I read Christopher Lash actually in this time period, and I was like, well, the American left is too busy talking about fucking post-structuralism and like occasionally maybe venturing to maybe try to like unionize like adjunct professors, but you're not even dealing with the fact that like teachers unions are illegal, basically illegal in large parts of the country, and and those are professional unions, and like I still don't see you guys talking about the honesty of the union problem. And I'm in a union, by the way, and I can tell you, like, when most leftists talk about unions, I'm like, you have never been in one. It is clear because you think it's like all Scandinavia and fun shit, and like you've never dealt with the fact that union leadership is often no longer has any relationship to workers, that it's highly professionalized, it's basically pack operatives, and that we have to there's a real struggle, both not just for the unions to battle for us, because also like. Do you guys know most unions don't even take oppositional bargaining anymore? Most professional unions don't do oppositional bargaining.
Yep.
That's insane. And then I discovered the history of it in Scandinavia, which was much more dark than I thought, that as the social democratic parties became the state and the unions became more apparatuses, they actually collaborated to do stuff like wage suppression so that you could have full employment without profitability dips.
I think one of the reasons, even though I didn't know it at the time, I guess like just sort of hearing you on different shows and stuff, and then learning about your more conservative background and thinking about unions, I think both me and Don, we come from, let's just say, very conservative backgrounds, to say the least. And, I go home and talk to my family who are both, don't have any college education, work as like, pretty shit paid, like mental health technicians at like a state facility. But hearing them talk about their unions, they are talking about exactly the same thing you just talked about. And then you talk to people in the DSA who are like, yeah, let's make sure we go like hold all of our meetings at the AFL-CIO. And it's like, are any of you in a union? Like, do you know, like there are like things that are really fucking serious and like major problems. But I think that is something that does get obscured pretty heavily, maybe because of the disconnection from them.
Well, I mean, I think that's a lot of it. I think also both the AFL-CIO now and the DSA are just satellites of the Democratic Party, to be honest. They really serve much other function.
I mean, I don't think you're saying anything that we haven't said at one point or another on this show.
I mean, like, remember, I take the cybernetic Bears theory that the function of a thing is what it actually does, not what it self-justifies as, but what it actually does. So like the function of education in America is, yes, to make people better informed workers and citizens or whatever. It does kind of do that. It is also basically its larger function over child care and class sorting. That's what it does. All the talk with equity, it's almost like a bad faith response to that. Like most teachers see themselves as propagators of social equity, and yet they participate in the institution that is the greatest barrier to it. But because we can let a few people through, or we can tell ourselves that we don't deal with that fact. And I deal with that as a teacher, and it's something that I lose sleep over it, actually.
Yeah,
my larger
I could
role
see that.
in this. And when I was an academic, it was a bigger thing, because I would hear people who talked even better game on social equity and this stuff and like radical politics, and yet they still recruited their students from rich suburbs. And they knew they did it.
I mentioned I'm a therapist. I have a social work background, and I work in a nonprofit in like adult education workforce development. And one of the very first things, even whenever I was doing, my internship there, one of the first questions I asked was like, what is the function of what this sort of nonprofit does? Like, what is it really doing? And it struck me that once you start asking questions in that way, you just come to radically different conclusions that strip away all the woke veneer that I think typically like propagates in institutions like this.
Everyone talks about woke capital, but we don't often talk about woke institutionalism.
I'll give you my anarchist snaps for that, Derek.
So, and like, there are big problems with it. There's also this conflation that I think Lash speaks to in that Philippines essay, where a leftist fear of technocracy, but also love of it. I mean, like, most leftists are schizophrenic about technocratic answers to things. At one hand, we all want the workers and blah, blah, blah. On another hand, like, everybody wants gay space communism. Neither are really deal with the fact that they're based off technologies and stuff that are oriented a certain way. Lash's critique of Ellul is like, Ellul is right on a lot of this stuff, but then like, yeah, but it's kind of superficial. Like, technology doesn't drive itself. It is driven by the social apparatuses that have classes and individual people making these decisions, designing them, and programming them. So they can develop clues, they can develop institutional logics that push people through it as a feedback loop, but someone still designed that shit. Yeah. And it was designed to do a certain thing. And ironically, I'm reading some of the other stuff Lash mentioned. I'm actually going to throw another book at you.
Yeah, go for it.
A Short History of Socialism by Georg Lichtheim, which is hard to get. A friend of mine, Jeremy Salmon of another podcast, actually sent it to me on the promise that I'd read it. People have now gotten to be like, I want Varn's take on this book. I'm going to send him the book. So
that's one way to do it.
But Lichtheim is actually someone Lash cites when they're talking about Weberian sociology of religion and how it's compatible with Marxism. And he actually says, like, yeah, and because Jacques Ellul is onto this, but because Jacques Ellul is not interested in who owns things or who's designing them, he's just interested in the way that they're playing out and the way propaganda works, but not the ownership of propaganda and what it serves. He misses part of the function. But he's actually better than a lot of the so-called Marxists who aren't even looking at that. That's his other point. Ellul's got all these major flaws, and yet he sees stuff that Marxists should see, but don't, because they're not looking at it. They're all right now chasing the idea of the revolutionary subject as student, which is ridiculous.
I think that's one of the things that we came away from Dialectic of Defeat with, actually, that was most memorable was the fact that someone like Spengler, a conservative social critic, in many ways was much more fucking right than a lot of the Marxists were. And there's something important about recognizing why is that the case, that sometimes like these more conservative social critics are actually much more on point, even if though, you know, it is superficial and it misses a lot.
Like, again, I've read Spengler. I've actually, like, I've done podcasts on him. I was very influenced. One of my ways into the left was, believe it or not, C.L.R. James was a big Spengler fan.
Oh yeah, maybe I had heard that, but yeah. Anyway, a little bit of a shocker for some listeners out there.
Yeah, you know, Spengler, who was a ethnicist, he was not a racialist because he didn't believe in biological race. Actually, and he thought that was actually a degeneration. Weird, but you know, it's kind of like some weirdo like Julia Savola who's like talking about like spiritual Semitism as a problem, but like, you know, like was also mad at Nazis because they were too biological. And like, why would you wipe out a whole, you know, they're spiritual degenerates. You don't have to physically kill them. And like, it's like basically like Nazism is too modern. That's the problem.
Real radical shit.
Yeah, you know, but in a way though, they're on the things that you read through. A lot of Marxists often don't engage with, often for one thing, like this trend of people's histories and stuff, I think is good in some ways for agency, but it's fundamentally dishonest to pretend that the marginal subjects drive capitalist society as somehow they already do. I mean, if they already do, they wouldn't be fucking marginalized. Like that basic contradiction in historiography leads to bad understandings of things.
Since we're coming back to this, I am curious to get your thoughts on this. What do you think it is that prevents Marxist, leftist, whoever, from, I guess, reading more broadly or more thoroughly in terms of history and historiography? Because I will tell you, you know, I coming from more of a, I guess, like more right-wing background earlier in life, you know, I did read some of that shit as I was going more left. And it strikes me that even now, I rely on some of those histories more than Marxist history to feel like I'm understanding what it is that capital is or how people talk about it, who are in support of the system. I don't know, maybe for a lot of our listeners who, you know, might be thinking about this for the first time, why do you think it is that most people on the left don't read those sources?
There's a couple of things. One of the things that I like to talk about, like the PMC like popularity right now, is actually kind of a bad consciousness that most leftists realize they're not actually, they don't meet the classical image of the working class. They might be precarious, they might be proletarianized, but they aren't producing commodities. They aren't often even working in socialization. A lot of them aren't even fucking employed in any real sense, and so they're, you know, they would be sub-proletariat in some ways, but also come from fairly stable backgrounds. And I think a lot of it is they don't want to see one. I think a lot of them is fear of contamination. There's a lot of, particularly after social media, leftism had to become a thing. Dear God, I wish Left Book didn't exist, but
it was a mistake in every possible sense of the word.
Yeah, and as a person who like participated in it very early on, and like in some ways founded some of it, like oh God. But in a very real way, there's a sense of, there's a fear of social contamination, because I don't think people actually believe a lot of the stuff in the sense that they're not acting out of their own interests, that this is kind of a veneer on other problems. And the PMC thesis, I think, is an example of that, where they're getting onto something true, like that someone like Eric Olin Wright in Understanding Class talks about. Like, you have to read, and like Lash talks about too in this book, specifically, again, in that Ellul essay, like you have to read Weberian and other kinds of understandings of opportunity class, intra-class competition, strata within classes, sectional competitions that aren't just race. Like, we got race down and we might have gender, but like sectional competitions between regions, between fields of employment, between ethnicities and ethnic groups that are not quite racialized, both within people of color and within quote-unquote white people, truly understanding provisional whiteness and its relationship to the construction of many virulent kinds of racism. You know, weirdly, I've been watching a lot of old Spike Lee movies, and like they're better on that than most leftists are. Like Spike Lee gets, for example, that the reasons why Italians in particular can be virulently racist is they're barely considered white by good white society. And so like they coexist and demarcate in a way that leads to a lot of tensions, but they actually do function in the same place. And the polite white society isn't even there, you know, can't even get there. And also, like, a lot of the backlash at like white power structures gets thrown at these poor white people because that's the people you can get to. And that leads to a lot of that further repeats the cycle. And like Spike Lee saw that because he was a black man who grew up in an Italian neighborhood and saw the way that worked out. And he often hired actors who were Italians who grew up in black neighborhoods. Like he did that deliberately. So it was kind of street sociology. He was also middle class. And he knew that. Whereas most leftists come from an even more reified world than that. Like it's a trope that you hear even reactionaries thrown out. She's it's another wasp telling me about my white privilege. And like as a person who's Southern, Jewish, was constantly talking in racist society that I had like black ancestry, and that was some way to like come at me as a kid. You get this weird double consciousness that isn't forward in leftism. So why don't they want to look at it? Because I think they're afraid that they'll see themselves in it. They'll see that they're also not oppressed. That they'll see that, a lot of their identification and moralization actually serves a pernicious function. That they have a function still in capital that they cannot look at, and right-wingers take advantage of it. Okay, I'll give you an example of this.
Yeah,
and this is something Lash is very frustrated with, particularly in his later writings. Like, these early writings are about the left. Later on, he actually does analysis of the 80s right and Phyllis Schlafly and all that points out how bad faith this is, but that they're actually talking to problems that working class people experience. So one of the things that he says is like, there's been a failure and deracination of education, but also more and more working class people are exposed to it. Before, that was not a problem for them because they didn't get it beyond, like I think about my grandfather who was very literate, but had like a 5th grade education because he's a brick worker. He didn't need anything more than that. Like, he literally made bricks. So like, he was widely read, but that was just the way it was. And Lash is on to how that's changing, but also that we don't want to look at that. We don't want to look at how that's changing because it says a bunch of things. Another thing he says that we don't want to look at is we talk about revolution, and he was like, well, we go to these third world revolutions that can happen, right? One thing that he doesn't say, but he kind of implies, well, these third world revolutions are basically bourgeois nationalist revolutions. They're not actually, he doesn't say that. But he's like, that's really what they are, and that's what they follow, that model that seems to follow from like the insurrectionary nation state model that from like the 1800s. And like, he's like, the post-industrial state as it exists, that is not a relevant model for. The nuclear bomb makes that irrelevant. Like, you can have coups, but you can't have an insurrectionary war like that. You can nuke a city in a day. It's like when I laugh, I'm not anti-gun, actually, people might think, when I say this, but I laugh when like leftists start adopting the same gun delusions as rightists, and they're like, we need them to fight the man. I'm like, you might need them to protect yourself, but like, if you're really fighting the man, they can nuke you. Your AR-15 does shit against a cluster bomb.
I don't know, Derick. I mean, if my aim gets real solid and there's a Predator drone coming at me, I'm telling you, I at least have a chance.
Yeah, ask some really good shooting Afghanis how that goes.